when our worst encounter is within our own family. I was still a child when this story unfolded. My parents were getting divorced, but my father had always been violent. Since he didn't bother finding an apartment for himself and was very demanding, he continued to live with us during the divorce. One evening, I experienced the fright of my life. My mother had put us to bed early, my sisters and me. I always had trouble sleeping because I could hear my father shouting insults at my mother for hours on end. He couldn't understand why she wanted to leave him. It was obvious, but narcissists usually don't admit their mistakes. They believe they're perfect. That night, it must have been almost midnight, and I was just starting to doze off when a new scream woke me up. This time, it was my mother. My sisters and I rushed out of bed and found my mother in tears on the stairs. My father had slapped her so hard that her head violently hit the wall. She was screaming at him not to touch her. We immediately rushed to her to surround and protect her. I was 9 years old, but I understood. After all, I had always been afraid of my father. He always harmed us. I was afraid of him, but I refused to let my mother be at his mercy. We took my mother to her room, while my older sister prevented my father from coming upstairs. He kept repeating that she was hysterical and crazy, never acknowledging that he was the problem. My mother struggled to calm down, but she told us to get dressed quickly. When my father saw us coming down, dressed to go out, he started insulting her again, asking where she was taking us. As if she was obligated to tell him. Fearing he might decide to hit one of us, she just told him she was taking us to McDonald's to take our minds off things. She grabbed her coat, and we got into the car before she started it. However, instead of heading to the fast food restaurant, she drove around the city, parking in a lot I didn't even know. From there, she guided us on foot to downtown, to the police station. It was too much. She had seen the hatred in his eyes. He could have beaten her to death if we hadn't arrived. Just as we reached the police station door, we saw my father. He was coming out of the park just across the street. He had been looking for us. Unfortunately, he saw us too. We hurried inside, and, seeing our panic, a policewoman took us to an office. As she closed the door, we heard my father entering the building, yelling insults, asking where my mother was while calling her all sorts of names, saying she had nothing against him, that she had no right, that kind of thing. He screamed like that for almost a whole hour. I was in tears, in my mother's arms. My older sister was trembling with fear. My other sister was the only one who could speak and tell the officer who stayed with us everything that had happened. After a while, he finally left. The police station suddenly became quiet. Another policewoman stuck her head through the door and asked us if he had been drinking. But no. He never drank, he was naturally like that. The police explained that they had told my father to pack his things and leave. They kept us in their premises for some time, making sure he was gone, while taking my mother's statement. However, my mother still wanted to take us to the fast food restaurant before going home. My sister desperately wanted to retrieve her phone, which she hadn't taken in the panic. The police were all reassuring. They just asked us to call them urgently if my father came back, then we were able to head home. The house was silent. Everything was dark. My father's car was no longer there. Relieved, my mother asked my sister to hurry and get her phone, while we waited in the car. She took the keys and ran to the house, but when she opened the door, she screamed in terror. My panicked mother opened the car door to get out, only to see my father charging towards her in fury. She barely had time to pull her leg in before he slammed the door on it. She then had the reflex to lock the doors, although worried about my sister. He started shouting and insulting her again, pulling on the handles and hitting the car. This lasted for about 10 minutes before sirens interrupted my father. 2 police cars and a van arrived in front of our house. My sister had run to her room and called the police with her phone that she had come to fetch. My father still blamed my mother, shouting that she dared to call the cops, even though she had been in front of him all this time. The police almost jumped out of their vehicles, hands on their batons. One of them pinned my father against the car and handcuffed him, asking why he was still there, reminding him that they had told him to leave. My father was no longer so proud, and the only excuse he found to say was, "But I couldn't find my boxers, actually." The police stayed while he finally prepared a suitcase. They waited for him to get into his car, which he had hidden further away, and disappear around the corner before finally assuring my mother that they would patrol all night. My mother thanked them, and we left the neighborhood to finally go to the promised restaurant. However, when we arrived in the next street, my father's car, still hidden further away, joined us on the road to follow us. What he hadn't planned, though, was that the police van was also following. When we arrived at the restaurant, my father continued straight on the main road and left the city, while the police made 3 rounds around McDonald's, causing questions from all the customers. Once home, we were afraid he might still be waiting for us, but, as promised, the police came to stand guard all night. Needless to say, we still didn't sleep that night and had a hard time sleeping for several weeks. I've been an insomniac since then, and today, at 28, I can't sleep without sleeping pills.